If you take a look at the kalam, there's a number of terms in there that I would argue are not so clearly defined that they avoid equivocation.
That's his first logical mistake. It's a category error. Arguments don't commit themselves to ambiguous or unclear definitions. That would be the responsibility of the person who employed the argument. You can ask them for the definition, but if you demand that an argument define every word they employ, you get an infinite regress of definitions. Thus, it's a category error for Matt to say the kalam uses undefined terms.
For example, what does begins to exist mean?
If Matt did research, he would know that Craig in the literature defines what it means to begin to exist in terms of 3 criteria, namely, 1. X begins to exist at t, if X exists in reality, and there is no timeless state of affairs where X exists. 2. It is a tensed fact that X exists. 3. It is the first time at which X begins to exist, or if X had in fact existed prior to the moment it just came into existence, there's a separation between its past existence, and that separation consists of a time at which X ceased existing.
Within our local presentation of the universe, it could be argued that nothing begins to exist, that everything within the universe is merely matter and energy transposing, taking different forms and shapes. That while at some point it's true, Matt Dillahunty did not exist, everything that makes me has existed prior to me.
There are 2 things to say here. The first is that given the definition of begins to exist Craig provided, he's wrong to say that things don't begin to exist. It doesn't matter if Matt wants to highlight the fact that they were mere particles or rearrangements of the same material prior to the thing that beginning to exist began to exist. That doesn't matter. That's a red herring. We have a definition of what begins to exist mean. He could hawk all around. He wants about materials being rearranged. It's his fault. He doesn't know the literature and doesn't know the definition of begins to exist. He's operating with an assumption of some stipulative definition of begins to exist, and that's where his confusion stems. A second thing it seems as though he's doing accidentally is launching some sort of ex-material objection that mirrors the inductive support for the causal principle. So the causal principle is going to say that all observed beginnings were caused to exist, so probably all beginnings have causes. The ex-material principle notes that all things beginning to exist were reconfigurations of pre-existent materials, so probably all things that begin to exist from pre-existent material. Prima facie wouldn't seem the ex-material and causal principle compete. So then why is the ex-material principle used as an objection to the kalam? It's used as an objection because when we're trying to infer that the universe had a cause, the proponent of the ex-material principle via the principle is going to argue that the cause must be in terms of a reconfiguration. This is incompatible with the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo typically used by people running the kalam who want to argue for a god. If one wanted to defend the kalam against this ex-material principle, perhaps they may allege that the ex-material principle entails an infinite regress, and given the motivations for the second premise, this is problematic. Perhaps an additional reason to select between the 2 principles in favor of the causal principle is that the causal principle plausibly seems a priori, as opposed to the ex-material one. A potential motivation for thinking the causal principle is a priori is that it's not as though we suspect events or things have caused this because of our inductive generalization or experience with causation in the past, but rather it seems the causal principle is an assumption we make about things irrespective of our prior knowledge of the thing. For example, say I find a new animal species, or a new mineral, or an entirely new technology, and say that I investigate looking for a cause of these things and I don't find one. It's not as though I'm going to conclude that therefore they probably don't have a cause. And it's not as though my prior instances of causation would justify me in thinking that this case is akin to the others. Perhaps an argument from chaos would be a great reason to differentiate between the 2 principles. So perhaps if one is under the conviction that given the fact that the 2 principles compete, that therefore the universe is exception to both of them, and that when it began to exist it was neither cause nor rearrangement of prior existent material. If what motivates this plausibly ad hoc and awkward situation where I am affirming the fact that the universe began to exist uncaused and from no prior material is merely the fact, and I'm also insisting on the equal status of the ex-material principle, that perhaps this is reason to discriminate against it. For if the universe can begin to exist uncaused and from no prior material, not only does this conclusion render both principles non-universal, it would plausibly render all other causal principles that are supported by induction non-universal as well. In addition to that, perhaps it causes epistemological difficulties with knowing, or at least when attempting to know what is likely caused. So let's select 3 given objects arbitrarily: my phone, my wallet, my bike. Those 3 objects, if I'm looking at them and say trying to decipher whether they have a cause or not, and I affirm the universe began to exist without a cause, it doesn't matter that it's the universe per se. Once I affirm that any given thing begins to exist without a cause, I have no way of assigning a probability that for any given thing I'm observing, that thing is more likely caused or uncaused, given the fact that if something had began to exist absent a cause for doing so, it's not as though there could be anything about it in virtue of which it's selected to begin exist uncaused. Suffice it to note that despite these considerations being brief, I've taken that I've laid out at least some compelling reason to select a causal principle if it is in fact competing with the next material one.
So what does it mean to say that something begins to exist? But also there's a difficulty in assessing that category if we're looking at the universe and saying the universe began to exist. Is that true? Our local presentation of the universe does apparently have a beginning, but does that mean that there wasn't the matter or energy prior to that? Does it mean it was produced in a multiversic sense? Did it always exist and this expansion is the latest in a series, or did it always exist and this expansion is the one and only? But to say the universe began to exist is at least dubious.
4 fallacies, 3 of which were red herrings, 1 of which was a non sequitur. What were the 3 red herrings? The first red herring was his consideration about whether, before the universe beginning to exist, there was energy. We've posited a definition for it begins to exist independent of what was there prior to its existence, thus it's a red herring. The second red herring was the consideration about a multiverse, and the third red herring was the red herring about whether the universe is an expansion in a series that expands once or many times. And the non sequitur was his claim that if one were to say the universe began to exist, that would be highly dubious. It's a non sequitur because Craig in literature commonly posits a definition for begins to exist that Matt Dillahunty either has never read or ignores. Thus, his inference is predicated on misunderstanding of what people are talking about in the context of the kalam when they say that the universe began to exist.
So, of course, Matt began to exist. But when we're talking about things and making arguments in this sense, we have to be a lot more specific, because we open ourselves up to equivocating between, oh, well, when I say the universe exists, what I mean is that this particular pattern of the universe began to exist. And now we're not talking about the substance, but about the structure.
If when Matt is drawing on this equivocation, he's attempting to attack the kalam, then it's a straw man. If he's attempting to correct people that typically make this mistake, then it's a red herring, because that's not the kalam, and his video is predicated on the attack of the kalam. The vast majority of the rest of the video contains little to no substance in terms of Matt actually attacking the kalam, so I'm going to skip around to some of the key fallacies he commits, some of which are just hilarious, and then I'm going to also showcase the massive confusions he has predicated around what it means for an argument to argue for something.
The kalam cosmological argument is not an argument for the existence of God. That's an undeniable fact. That is not an argument for the existence of God. It shouldn't even be classified as an argument for the existence of God. At most, it is an argument for the universe must have some causal explanation.
Matt makes the claim the argument's not about God. When he says an argument is not about a given X, what does he mean by that? So he's got 3 options. The first option is that when he says an argument is not about a given X, he thinks that the argument relates in no way to motivate the truth value of X. The second option is that when he says an argument is not about X, he thinks that the argument doesn't relate sufficiently to motivate the truth value of X. And on the third account, he thinks that an argument is not about a given X if X, say, designates over Y and Y is not referenced. So let's just plug that into the case at hand. When it comes to God, is he making the case that the kalam doesn't motivate the truth value of the proposition that God exists? If that's what he thinks, then he's wrong, because obviously, if the kalam is true, it does motivate the truth value of the proposition that God exists, even mildly. So sufficient account. Now, if he thinks that the kalam does not sufficiently raise the probability of God, and that's what he means when he says that the argument isn't about God, well, then he's just speaking very unclearly, because he in no way made reference to sufficiency, propositional relation, and relation and motivation, so clearly he's referring to something else. Now, I think what he's referring to is that he's upset that the argument doesn't use the word God, which is insane. That's totally irrelevant. That's trivial. If I make an argument that doesn't use the word God, however, the conclusion of my argument establishes that God exists with 100% certainty, you'd have to be ludicrous to make the claim that my argument wasn't about God, right? So if Matt's just upset here that we didn't use the word God in an argument that motivated the claim that God exists, I don't know what he's on about. I'm going to end off with Matt's dumbest section of the whole video, wherein he doesn't rule out the universe as having caused itself, because he's skeptical about what a state of affairs in which causality breaks down. He thinks causality breaks down because it's the first moment in time, which is actually just to say that the universe has the first moment, and he's effectively then communicating that he's skeptical that the universe couldn't have caused itself because the universe had a first moment. Utterly incoherent.
Let's grant that. Let's just say that, yep, if something begins to exist, it has a cause, and the universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. What do we know about the cause of the universe assuming that the cause exists, what do we know about it? I don't know. I don't have any way to investigate it. Oh, well, we can definitely know that the universe isn't the cause of itself. Well, I'm not convinced that we can definitely know that.
Here there's an implicit taxicab fallacy. Matt makes the claim that he can't definitively rule out the universe as having caused itself. Why is that a taxicab fallacy? Well, if his standard for knowledge is definitive, then he can never use probabilistic forms of reasoning like induction, abduction, and inference to the best explanation. Presumably he in fact does do that, but here he makes a non-principled exception, and thus it's a taxicab fallacy.
Because causality is necessarily temporal, and temporal causality breaks down at t=0, which would be the origin of the universe.
So here we get the assertion that causation is necessarily temporal. This is a philosophically contested position, so he's going to need to do more than just merely assert his take here. This mere assertion went on to serve as the basis for his non sequitur that we can't rule out the universe as having caused itself. We could rule out the hypothesis that the universe caused itself, or for any given thing to cause itself, it would have to exist to do the causing. That's a contradiction. And my search for a good objection to the kalam continues. That's the end of this video.